My husband is planning a cruel revenge for me and his best friend, as he helped me hide my affair. Let me give you some background. My name is Ashley, I'm 29, and I'm married to Richard, who is 30. I'm a 29-year-old woman married to Richard, who is 30. My husband and I have been married for 5 years. We don't have any kids yet because we wanted to wait until later in life. I live in the United States. My husband's best friend is Jared. I met my husband, Richard, when I was 22. I had been trying online dating for a while, hoping to find someone special. After so many disappointing matches and awkward chats, though, I was starting to lose hope. I still believed in love and finding the right person, but I was getting tired of the whole online dating scene. After weeks of swiping right and sending messages, I started to think that real connections couldn't be made through screens and messages. Then, out of the blue, I got a message from my husband, Richard. His message was simple and genuine, which caught my attention, so I decided to give it a shot. He seemed genuine, which stood out to me, so I decided to give it a shot and replied. We hit it off right away, our chats were easy and we found we had a lot in common. We talked about everything under the sun and it felt like we'd known each other for ages when we finally decided to meet in person. I was nervous but excited as we sat in the cafe chatting and laughing. It was like I could be myself around him, no pretense or awkwardness. By the end of the night, I knew there was something different about Richard. He made me feel comfortable and understood in a way I hadn't felt before. Before we knew it, Richard and I were officially a couple. Within a few months, we took the big leap and moved in together. It felt like a natural progression. As our relationship and living situation progressed, our bond only grew stronger. We spent 2 incredible years together, facing life's challenges as a team. We shared laughter, tears, and countless unforgettable moments. It was during this time that we both realized we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. After much thought and heartfelt conversations, we decided to take the plunge and get married. We decided to tie the knot, and it was a joyous occasion surrounded by our loved ones. Richard worked in sales, while I worked in human resources. As a result, Richard was always on the move for his sales job, traveling far and wide to meet clients and close deals. His days were a whirlwind of airports, hotels and meetings, while I held down the fort in my cozy office. My days were more routine in the city, handling things like employee benefits and payroll. Our lives were like 2 parallel paths running alongside each other, but never quite crossing. Richard would come home with stories of his travels, and I'd listen from our living room. Sometimes the distance between us felt real, but we stayed connected. Richard would call or text me late at night to bring in more money to cover the bills. I was at home more, so I kept things tidy while he was at work. I cooked, cleaned and made sure everything was in order. Our setup might sound old-fashioned, but it just made sense for us. We made it work, even though our living situation was a bit unconventional. We both knew our roles and appreciated what each of us brought to the table. As Richard's trips became more frequent, I started feeling really lonely, even though I kept busy with chores and work. There was this emptiness that stuck around like something was missing. At first, I thought it was just a phase, but the loneliness kept growing. It wasn't just about missing him physically, it was like I missed having him around. His jokes, his warmth, everything. I'd count down the days. Even when he was home, I felt like we were drifting apart. I knew his job was important, but the loneliness was getting to me. I tried distracting myself with friends and hobbies, but nothing seemed to help. The loneliness just kept creeping in, making it hard to shake off. I knew something had to change. I needed to find ways to feel closer to Richard when he was away or focus more on things that made me happy during that lonely stretch. I crossed paths with Vince at work. He was a friendly coworker with a good sense of humor. We hit it off, and we'd hang out at lunch, crack jokes, and sometimes grab coffee together. Vince had a way of making me laugh, and being around him made the loneliness less intense. We got closer, and I felt comfortable opening up to him. He was a great listener, and he was always there when I needed someone. Vince was a great guy. He had a good sense of humor, and we got on really well. We used to have lunch together, have a laugh, and sometimes grab coffee. He was always there for me when I needed someone to talk to. He was a great listener and I felt comfortable opening up to him. Before I knew it, Vince and I were close friends. I could rely on him to brighten my day and chase away the loneliness. As time passed, Vince and I started flirting more. I knew it was wrong, but with Richard away so much, I kind of stopped caring about the consequences. Whenever Richard was out of town, I'd ask Vince to come over and watch a movie. Vince and I would often watch movies at my house, which was pretty fancy thanks to Richard's good salary. It was a great spot for hanging out, even though I felt guilty. Vince's attention helped fill the gap left by Richard being gone all the time. One night, I asked him to come over for a movie, and things got even flirtier between us. I was so into it that I didn't think about what might happen next. We opened a bottle of wine and started drinking. The flirting between us was intense. Before we knew it, we crossed lines we definitely shouldn't have. We had sex the next morning. I woke up feeling like garbage. I'd cheated on my husband. I was freaked out by what I'd done and kicked him out. Vince was out in a panic, but if I'm being honest, there was a part of me that kind of liked it. I was so lonely and Vince was so good at avoiding me that I didn't even realize he was still there. I knew I messed up big time. I tried to avoid Vince at work, but that didn't last long. I was tempted and before I knew it, we were back to square one. Vince didn't let things get weird at work. He'd still bring me coffee, lunch and shower me with compliments. Plus, he'd text me. I didn't even bother blocking him before I knew it, we were back to where we started in just a few days. We were sneaking around, having this secret thing going on. It was oddly convenient, especially with Richard. Vince was always on the road, but he'd still swing by my place and we'd hang out. His situation was similar, he had a girlfriend and lived with her, so his place wasn't really an option for our rendezvous. Sometimes he'd fib to his girlfriend, saying he had to work late just to sneak over to my place. One evening after work, he showed up at my door. Vince usually drove separately to avoid suspicion after we had sex. He decided to order food and had to step outside the gate to pick it up. Unfortunately, my husband's best friend Raymond decided to drop by while Vince was outside grabbing the food. Vince hadn't bothered to put on proper clothes, so he was just in a t-shirt. He was just in a t-shirt and boxers, as he just wanted to pick up the food and come back inside. Raymond caught on right away. I was busted, plain and simple. There was no way to dance around it. He looked like he wanted to bolt, but I chased after him, begging him not to spill the beans. I poured my heart out, telling him how lonely I'd been and pleading with him to keep it under wraps. I told him how lonely I'd been and asked him to keep it under wraps. I asked Raymond not to tell Richard, and he said he'd do it if I gave him money. It turned out he'd come over to borrow cash, but now he was demanding it as hush money. He wanted $2,000. He wanted $2,000 and said he'd keep quiet if I paid it. I gave him the money because I couldn't risk him telling Richard, but I made it clear that I wouldn't be his cash cow if he thought he could keep blackmailing me. He had another thing coming, of course. Raymond's situation made me give him the money. He wasn't pulling in much himself and played the role of stay-at-home dad. Raymond was the breadwinner while his wife Evelyn brought in a lot of money, easily making 7 figures without a solid education or marketable skills. Raymond didn't have many options for high-paying work anyway, so he had to depend on his wife. Raymond had some bad habits, so he spent money easily. Raymond stayed true to his word and kept my secret, but he'd often ask me for small amounts of cash, like 100. On 2 occasions, he had some pretty serious spending habits, especially when it came to blowing money on his vices. See, Raymond had some issues. He'd burn through all the money his wife gave him for the week or month on stuff like drugs and gambling. Then he'd be too ashamed to tell his wife, Evelyn, and come asking me for a loan. I'd usually give him the cash, feeling sorry for him and wanting to help. I was also grateful that he kept my secret as Vince and I carried on with our affair. I found myself feeling happier, at least in the moment. However, Richard started to notice the gaps in our relationship, even when he was home. I was glued to my phone, texting Vince behind his back. As Richard noticed our marriage hitting a rough patch, he went into overdrive to bring back the spark. He went all out. He tried everything to reconnect with me. He made romantic gestures and took me out on surprise dates. He even took me on spontaneous trips and to fancy dinners. He poured his heart into showing me love and affection, hoping it would fix what was broken. Despite his efforts, I couldn't. I couldn't shake the guilt of my affair with Vince. No matter how much Richard tried, I just couldn't get back into the groove we once had. I was caught between guilt and excitement. A few days ago, instead of going straight home, I decided to hang out with Vince for a change. We grabbed dinner. We chilled for a bit, then headed back to my place, but when we got there my heart sank seeing my husband's car in the driveway. I panicked and signaled for Vince to split, pretending he wasn't following me. He took off as I pulled into the garage. My mind was racing. Walking into the house, I was shocked to find my husband. I asked why he was home unexpectedly, preparing for the worst, but he brushed it off, saying he missed me and changed his plans at the last minute. I was relieved, but the close call left me shaken as the night went on. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, knowing how close I came to getting caught. It made me question everything and left me feeling even more stuck in this mess I'd made. I felt like a ton of bricks had hit me. I knew I had to end things with Vince and focus on fixing things with my husband. Despite the thrill Vince gave me, I loved my husband too much to lose him, so I decided to give it a few days. After a few days, I ended things with Vince and focused on my marriage. However, my husband had checked my phone that night and found out about my secret. He acted like nothing had happened, but the next day he seemed fine. We carried on as usual, and he even said he wouldn't be traveling for a while, which made me genuinely happy. I was happy and hopeful as the day went on. I made plans to meet Vince for dinner after work, planning to end things with him once and for all. Work flew by, but I couldn't shake the thought of the upcoming chat with Vince. When I finally brought up going out for dinner, Vince was game as long as I was picking up. The bill was our usual arrangement since Vince wasn't exactly rolling in cash despite the gravity of what was to come. There was a strange sense of normalcy as we made plans to meet later. Deep down, I knew this dinner would mark the end of our fling and the start of fixing things with my husband. I braced myself for we had a tough talk ahead of us, but I knew it was the first step to rebuilding what I'd messed up. When we got to the restaurant, we grabbed some food. After we'd eaten, I knew I had to have the talk with Vince. I didn't beat around the bush. I told him it was over between us. He seemed surprised and bummed out, but he took it like a champ. He was really understanding and said he understood where I was coming from. I felt a bit relieved but also a bit sad. I went home, but when I got there I saw something weird on the porch. I got out of the car and checked it out and found my stuff piled up there. I was really shocked. It felt like someone had sucker punched me out of nowhere. I hoped it was all a mistake, but as I went through my things, I realized they were mine. I tried calling my husband, but he ignored me. Finally, a text popped up on my phone. It was brutal. He didn't hold back, calling me every name in the book. He was really angry and said I'd betrayed him. He even dragged his best friend into it, saying he knew everything that was in the text. He made it clear he wasn't going to let me off the hook. He promised revenge that would haunt me. And he reminded me that even the car I drove was a gift from him. I felt completely shattered. I was in disbelief, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. It felt like my whole world had just exploded, and I had no idea how to even begin picking up the pieces. I was in tears as I realized the mess I was in. I tried calling my husband again, but he kept ignoring me. With no other choice, I had to leave, but since the car was his, I had to Uber it. I felt lost and alone, with nowhere to crash. My family wasn't around, and I'd just broken things off with James, so the only option left was crashing at Raymond's and his wife's house. Thankfully, they were cool about it and let me in. We waited until the next day. Before his wife got back, I told Raymond everything. It turned out he already knew that my husband had threatened him and told him he would ruin him. I was really scared for what was coming next. I felt totally exposed and unsure of what to do. Everything felt like it was falling apart. I'm feeling isolated and unsure of how to proceed. I'm seeking guidance on how to handle and reconcile with my husband. He has a reputation for being cold and ruthless. He's someone you wouldn't want to cross paths with. He seldom makes threats, but when he does, he follows through with unwavering determination. He's mentioned seeking revenge against me in the most extreme manner possible. Despite my attempts to reach out by phone, he's ignoring my calls. What course of action do you suggest I take in this situation? Update: I was really worried about what would happen as a result of my actions. I had an affair with my husband's best friend and he helped me cover it up. I never thought I'd be back here updating you all, but I've received a lot of messages asking for updates, so here I am. It's been almost a month since I last reached out and I want to update you all on. As it turns out, my husband wasn't kidding about seeking revenge. I didn't even stay at Raymond and his wife's place for a day before I discovered that he had drained our joint account. Most of the money in there was his since he earns a lot more than me, but he took my share too. I had been saving up for a while, but it was everything we had saved up together, so I was left with nothing when I found out my husband had drained our joint account. I was pretty devastated, to be honest. I cried my eyes out, and even Raymond and his wife noticed. She offered to help me out financially, but that never happened after my husband got to her. It seems my husband went on a rampage to expose me. He must have snooped through my phone and found Vince's number, then backed down. He shared screenshots of my chats with Vince and Raymond with everyone, my family, his family, Vince, Raymond, and even Raymond's wife. It felt like my whole world was crashing down. First, I learned from Vince that his girlfriend had dumped him and kicked him out. He had no choice but to move back in with his parents to avoid being homeless. Then Raymond's wife blew up when she found out he'd helped cover up my cheating. She believed cheating was wrong. He was wrong, and the fact that he'd helped me made her think he was cheating too. She was also angry about his gambling and drug use, which she'd suspected but never confirmed. She kicked both Raymond and me out, making it clear she was filing for divorce. We had to pull our money to afford a hotel room together. We were trying to keep costs down by splitting the bill. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. My husband, who knew that Raymond kept drugs at home, decided to call the police on him. Raymond hadn't finished packing his things because he was still hoping his wife would take him back. So when the police showed up, the police raided Raymond and his wife's house. It was a total nightmare. Raymond was still trying to win his wife back because she was the main breadwinner and without her he'd be completely broke. However, my husband's call to the police just made everything even more chaotic. The situation escalated quickly when the police arrived. Raymond and his wife were both arrested because they were the ones living in the house where the drugs were found. The kids were too young to be involved in anything like this, so the blame fell on Raymond or his wife. They ran a drug test, which showed that Raymond was using drugs while his wife wasn't. It was pretty clear who was responsible. Raymond got arrested. Luckily, we'd already paid for the hotel, so at least I didn't have to stress about the bill. It might sound harsh, but I couldn't afford it on my own. Sadly, my parents refused to take me in after my husband spilled the beans. My parents found out about my affair and they're very strict Christians, so they basically kicked me out and said I was never welcome back. Just when you think it can't get worse, I lost my job too. Vince faced the same fate. Everyone found out about our affair and it was like we had targets on our backs at work. Vince had to quit to avoid being homeless, moving in with his folks. But for me, losing my job was even worse because my husband's friends with the boss, which made things way worse. We managed to cover about a week's stay at the hotel, but I'm already worried about what happens when the money runs out. I'll be able to afford it on my own. My only option now is to reach out to one of my siblings for a place to stay, but they all live out of state. It would mean starting over in a new place, but I'll have to wait until after the divorce. Richard's made it clear he's filing for divorce. He said he'll send someone with. I just have to let him know where I'm staying at the hotel. I'm not feeling too optimistic about finding a job. My resume isn't anything special, and the only reason I got my current job was because of Richard's connections with the CEO. I don't see much hope for getting anything out of the divorce. Since we don't have kids, there's no chance of child support. Plus, the house is in Richard's name and it was a gift from his grandfather long before we even met. He had it before we got together. On top of that, we signed a prenup before we got married. And then there's the cheating. I can't imagine any judge looking kindly on that. I don't think the judge would look kindly on that, so realistically, I'm not expecting to get much out of the divorce. It's a tough pill to swallow, but I have to face reality. Honestly, I feel most sorry for Raymond. He's facing serious consequences for drug abuse, and it breaks my heart. I feel like the person who helped me cover up my affair is the one who's going to suffer the most. I knew it was wrong, but I never imagined things would spiral out of control like this. My husband's actions have essentially ruined our lives right now. I'm homeless and struggling to find a job. Vince had to move away just to avoid being in the same situation. Raymond's in jail now, and it looks like he'll be there for a while. He can't afford bail, so he's stuck there until they decide what to do with him. It's all because of my infidelity. I feel so guilty. Raymond's wife has the money to help him, but she's not willing. She won't even pay for a lawyer, so he's stuck with whatever the state provides. As we all know, that usually doesn't end well. She's determined to divorce him, and there's no way he'll get custody of the kids. He'll be lucky if he doesn't end up behind bars. On top of the drug charges, he's unlikely to get custody in the divorce, even if he avoids jail time. Being homeless won't help his case. Alimony is probably off the table too, thanks to the prenup. All in all, I've reached new heights of disdain for prenups. Did I mention that Evelyn Raymond's wife comes from a wealthy family? That's why he had to sign one. Either way, I hope you can take something away from my story. Don't cheat, it's just not worth it. As for me, I'm left with two options. I could swallow my pride and ask my siblings for money to buy a ticket and stay with them, but I know it's unlikely. I could face the grim reality of ending up in a homeless shelter by next week. Please learn from my mistakes and don't cheat. It's a road you don't want to go down.